May 8, 1942, somewhere in the Coral Sea, 600 miles northeast of Australia, the aircraft carrier USS Lexington is dying. 2 Japanese torpedoes and 2 bombs struck her during the morning's air attack, and internal explosions have been ripping through the ship ever since. Aviation fuel vapors are pooling in compartments below the hangar deck. Fires are burning in spaces that the damage control teams can no longer reach. Captain Frederick Sherman has given the order to abandon ship. Nearly 3,000 men are preparing to go over the side into the warm Pacific water, where destroyers are circling to pick them up. And in the middle of all of this, a 23-year-old aviation metalsmith named Julius Frey is doing something that, if you did not know the United States Navy, you would think was insane. Frey has grabbed a fire axe. He has fought his way down a passageway choked with smoke to a locked steel hatch. He swings the axe once. The lock breaks. He steps inside, takes off his steel helmet, and walks behind the counter of the ship's ice cream fountain. He fills his helmet to the brim with pineapple ice cream. Then he climbs back up to the flight deck, tosses the helmet full of ice cream to his buddy, and goes back down for a second helping. He is not alone. Across the Lexington's listing decks, sailors are lining up at the broken fountain to fill their helmets with ice cream before climbing down ropes into the Pacific Ocean. A young sailor named George von Hoff, 21 years old, later recalled in a 2002 interview with the United States Naval Institute that the only thing he ate that entire day was ice cream, scooped out of his own helmet. Another sailor named Walt Nelson, from Torpedo Squadron 2, remembered sitting on the flight deck eating pilfered ice cream when the final order came to go over the side. A warrant officer broke the lock on a second freezer and handed out vanilla to a dozen men standing in line, as though they were at a county fair and not on a burning warship in the middle of the largest naval war in human history. Chicago Tribune reporter Stanley Johnston was aboard. His account in the book Queen of the Flat Tops, published later that year, recorded sailors lining their shoes up neatly on the flight deck before climbing down the ropes. Some men were carrying helmets that were not full of their personal belongings. They were full of ice cream. Destroyer USS Morris, destroyer USS Phelps, and destroyer USS Hammond closed in to pull survivors from the water. Phelps was later ordered to torpedo the Lexington and send her under. The Lexington went under that evening. Destroyer USS Phelps fired 5 torpedoes into the burning hull, and Lady Lex, as her crew called her, slipped beneath the surface of the Coral Sea. 216 men died. The Battle of the Coral Sea itself was the first naval engagement in history in which the opposing fleets never came within sight of each other. Every blow was struck by aircraft. The Americans lost the Lexington. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho and suffered heavy damage to the fleet carrier Shokaku. More importantly, the battle turned back the Japanese invasion fleet headed for Port Moresby in New Guinea, and it ensured that 2 Japanese fleet carriers would not be available for the decisive battle at Midway 1 month later. At Midway, in June of 1942, the United States Navy would sink 4 Japanese fleet carriers and fundamentally alter the course of the Pacific War. The ice cream that Julius Frey scooped from the Lexington's Gedunk bar was eaten on a ship that had helped make that victory possible. The rest of the Lexington's crew, 2,735 men, were saved. Some of them were still holding their helmets when they were hauled aboard the destroyers. The helmets were empty by then. The ice cream was gone. But the image of American sailors eating frozen dessert while their ship sank beneath them traveled across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, and eventually into the intelligence files of 2 nations that could not understand it. Because the question this story is actually about is not why those sailors ate ice cream on a sinking ship. Young men facing death will reach for anything that reminds them they are still alive. The question is why the ice cream was there in the first place. Why, in the middle of a war that was killing thousands of men every week, the United States Navy had decided that frozen dessert was a strategic priority. Why the same military that was building aircraft carriers and submarines and landing craft by the hundreds was also building something that no other navy on Earth would have considered worth the steel or the money. A floating ice cream factory costing more than $1 million, made of reinforced concrete, designed to produce 500 gallons of ice cream every single day and be towed across the open Pacific to men who were fighting and dying on islands whose names most Americans had never heard before. To understand why the United States military spent the equivalent of $17 million modern dollars on a concrete barge whose only purpose was to make ice cream in a combat zone, we need to go back, not to Pearl Harbor, and not even to the 1930s. We need to go back to a Secretary of the Navy named Josephus Daniels, to a constitutional amendment that banned alcohol across an entire nation, and to a country that, in the absence of beer, fell so deeply and permanently in love with ice cream that it carried that love all the way across the ocean and into the war. This is the story of how a frozen dessert became a weapon, how the richest nation on earth used industrial luxury to win a war that its enemies believed would be decided by willpower and sacrifice alone, and of why, in the end, the men who had been taught that suffering built warriors watched the men who had been raised on ice cream and Coca-Cola and chocolate fight harder, longer, and more effectively than any military analyst on either side of the war had predicted. We have to begin with a fact that sounds almost too perfect to be true. The reason the United States Navy was obsessed with ice cream in 1944 has its roots in a temperance crusade that began in 1914, 30 years before the first concrete ice cream barge was towed into the Western Pacific. In 1914, 4 years before the end of the First World War, and 5 years before Prohibition became national law, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels issued General Order No. 99. It banned the possession or consumption of alcoholic beverages on every vessel in the United States Navy. Sailors and Marines, who had been drinking rum and whiskey aboard ship for more than a century, were stunned. The fleet mocked it openly. Officers called their ships the USS Grape Juice Navy. The New York Tribune published cartoons lampooning Daniels as the admiral of the USS Grape Juice Pinafore. Sailors renamed a captured Mexican vessel USS Piffle until an admiral spotted it and ordered the name painted over. Senior officers protested formally. The protests were ignored. But something unexpected happened in the years that followed. With alcohol gone, the Navy needed a replacement. Not just any replacement. It needed something that could fill the psychological space that alcohol had occupied for generations. Something cold, something sweet, something social, something a 19-year-old sailor 8,000 miles from home could share with his shipmates at the end of a 12-hour watch and feel, for a few minutes, like a normal person living a normal life. The replacement that took hold, almost by accident at first, and then with gathering institutional momentum, was ice cream. The timing mattered enormously, because just 5 years after Daniels signed General Order No. 99, the 18th Amendment took Prohibition national, and the transformation that had begun in the Navy spread across the entire country at a speed that no one anticipated. American breweries, the same companies that had built the country's most advanced refrigeration, distribution, and bottling networks over decades of industrial expansion, pivoted almost overnight to survive. Yuengling, the oldest brewery in America, started making ice cream. Anheuser-Busch started making ice cream. Stroh's started making ice cream. The industrial infrastructure that had been designed and perfected over half a century to move millions of barrels of beer across a continent by rail and truck was suddenly repurposed to move frozen dessert instead. Creameries expanded. Refrigerated rail cars that had once carried kegs now carried drums of ice cream. The entire cold chain, the network of ice houses, refrigeration plants, and insulated transport vehicles that American business had built for alcohol was handed over wholesale to ice cream. The numbers are remarkable. According to the American Historical Association, between 1916 and 1925, ice cream consumption in the United States increased by 55%, while the population grew only 15%. By 1929, Americans were consuming more than 1 million gallons of ice cream every single day. The country had not merely replaced one vice with another. It had created an entirely new cultural habit, backed by an entirely new industrial supply chain, in barely a decade. By the time Prohibition was repealed in 1933, it did not matter. The country had been permanently changed. Ice cream was no longer a treat you ate on a summer afternoon. It was a cultural institution. Soda fountains had replaced saloons as community gathering places. Ice cream parlors had replaced beer halls. Families went out for ice cream the way their grandparents had gone out for a drink. And in the United States Navy, ice cream had become so deeply embedded in daily shipboard life that virtually every warship, larger than a destroyer, had its own ice cream fountain or freezer by 1941. Sailors called them Gedunk bars, a name whose origin is still debated. The dreadnought USS Pennsylvania had a full ice cream parlor with tiled walls depicting famous warships. The cruiser USS Memphis deployed in 1930 with a brand new $7,000 soda fountain, the equivalent of well over $100,000 today. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and the United States entered the Second World War, America did not leave its ice cream culture at home. It packed it up and shipped it to war. Popular tradition holds that Italy's Mussolini disparaged ice cream as too American and discouraged its production during the war. The United Kingdom banned commercial ice cream as a wartime sugar conservation measure. The United States military did the opposite. It made ice cream an official military supply priority. The Army Quartermaster Corps shipped 135 million pounds of dehydrated ice cream mix in 1943 alone. It provided the equipment and ingredients for approximately 80 million gallons of fresh ice cream per year. The United States military was, by that point, the single largest producer of ice cream in the world. Not the largest military producer, the largest producer, period. By February of 1945, the Army was building dedicated ice cream factories in forward combat areas to deliver half-pint cartons of ice cream directly into the foxholes where men were fighting and dying. This was not an accident. This was not a general being sentimental. This was doctrine. And the man who made it doctrine was the Under-Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, a man who would shortly become the first Secretary of Defense in American history. One of Forrestal's assistants wrote an internal assessment that has become one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of military logistics. It stated that the distribution of ice cream to ships and advanced bases must be increased, that, of all the specific actions listed, this should be given the highest priority, and that ice cream had been the most neglected of all important morale factors. Forrestal read the assessment and acted on it immediately, making ice cream distribution a top priority across the entire Navy. The corresponding Navy Ice Cream Report, released in July of 1945, documented the results of his directive. The Navy had distributed 48 million pounds of ice cream mix powder across the Pacific Fleet. It had installed approximately 48 dedicated ice cream machines aboard ships of the line. It had established ice cream production capability at every major advance base from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa. The numbers, when you step back and look at them, are extraordinary. 80 million gallons of ice cream per year, 135 million pounds of dehydrated mix shipped in 1943 alone. Half-pint cartons delivered to foxholes by February of 1945. No other military in the history of the world had attempted anything remotely like it. The man who was about to take charge of the entire American military establishment had looked at a global war being fought across 2 oceans and 6 continents, and concluded that the single most neglected morale factor, the thing that needed fixing before anything else, was ice cream, and then he built the infrastructure to fix it on an industrial scale. In 1944, as the Pacific Fleet pushed westward through the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and the Carolines toward the Japanese home islands, the Navy acquired 3 reinforced concrete barges from the Army Transportation Corps. They were designated BRL, which stood for Barge, Refrigerated, Large, Hulls, 45, 46, and 47. They were built by concrete ship constructors at National City, California. Each barge was 265 feet long, 48 feet wide, and 17 feet deep. They were constructed from reinforced concrete, a material chosen because steel was needed for warships, and concrete could be poured by relatively unskilled labor. They had no engines of their own. They were towed across the open ocean by tugboats, sometimes across thousands of miles of open water. Their sole purpose in the war was refrigeration and ice cream production. Each barge carried 2 50-ton York ice machines and a dedicated ice cream freezer that produced 10 gallons every 7 minutes. That translates to roughly 500 gallons per shift and roughly 5 tons of ice cream per day. The barges stored 2,000 gallons of finished ice cream at 15 degrees Fahrenheit and held 130,000 cubic feet of additional refrigerated space for frozen meat, vegetables, eggs, and cheese, enough to supply an entire naval task force at anchor. The conversion cost for each barge was approximately $1,100,000. The most documented of the three was BRL 3071, described in Worrell Carter's official Navy logistics history, beans, bullets, and black oil, as a 1,000-ton refrigerated provision storage barge. It was anchored at Buckner Bay, Okinawa, in the summer of 1945, named for Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., who had been killed in action on June 18th. The barge fed ice cream and refrigerated supplies to Navy ships and to Marines and Army units fighting ashore. The barges also operated from the massive naval anchorage at Ulithi Atoll, the staging point for the final assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Navy released a formal ice cream report in July of 1945, documenting the supply of 48 million pounds of ice cream mix powder and the installation of approximately 48 ice cream machines aboard Pacific Fleet vessels. The infrastructure that Forrestal had demanded was real. It was operating, and it was producing ice cream at industrial scale in the middle of the largest naval campaign in history. And the men who built the infrastructure that kept those barges running, the refrigeration units, the power generators, the docks, and the supply roads, were themselves one of the most remarkable organizations of the war. They were the Seabees, the Naval Construction Battalions, roughly 325,000 men, drawn from 60 skilled trades, deployed to more than 400 locations across the Pacific and Atlantic. Their motto was simple: we build, we fight. On the island of Tinian in the Marianas, 15,000 Seabees of the 6th Naval Construction Brigade performed what may be the single most impressive construction feat of the Pacific War. They laid out a road grid across the island in the exact pattern of Manhattan, because Tinian happened to be almost the same shape and size as the New York borough. They built 6 runways, each 8,500 feet long, from crushed coral and concrete. They used enough material to fill the Hoover Dam 3 times over, and none of the runways took more than 53 days to complete. And they did not just build runways. They adopted individual B-29 bombers, painting unit logos on the noses of the aircraft, and they provided their aircrews with better Quonset huts, proper mattresses, washing machines, cold beer, and ice cream. Always ice cream. The Seabees built the refrigeration infrastructure at every advance base where the BRL barges and the PX ice cream parlors operated. Without them, the ice cream would never have reached the front. But the barges, the Seabees, and the shipboard machines were only part of the story, because the men at the very tip of the spear, the Marines and soldiers on the islands who could not always reach a ship or a floating barge, had found their own ingenious ways to make ice cream. And the most creative solution came from a Marine fighter pilot named Major J. Hunter Reinberg. Reinberg commanded Marine Fighter Squadron 122, flying Vought F-4U Corsairs from the island of Peleliu in late September of 1944. His squadron had been living on canned rations and warm water for weeks. Peleliu was a nightmare of heat, coral, and Japanese resistance. Reinberg noticed that the temperature at 33,000 feet, well above the ceiling of Japanese anti-aircraft fire, which was ineffective above 28,000, was far below freezing. He had an idea. He requisitioned empty 50-caliber ammunition cans from the armory, filled them with a mixture of canned milk and cocoa powder, and bolted the cans into the wings of a Corsair. He called it Operation Freeze. The first attempt produced a melted slurry. The men devoured it anyway. On the second attempt, Reinberg rigged the cans under the maintenance panels on each wing, increasing capacity to roughly 10 gallons for 100 men. The mixture froze, but it was flaky and crystallized. On the third attempt, he welded small wind-driven propellers onto the ammunition cans so that the mix would churn as it froze during the high-altitude flight. The result was smooth, creamy chocolate ice cream at 33,000 feet above Japanese-held Palau. Word spread through the air group. The group operations officer, Colonel Caleb Bailey, confronted Reinberg and told him that he was not fooling anybody, that he had spies watching the squadron, and that he expected his ration delivered the following morning. Reinberg complied. An entire Marine air group was soon flying what amounted to dedicated ice cream production missions at altitudes where no enemy could touch them. The practice was not unique to the Pacific. According to a 1943 report in the New York Times, B-17 crews in Europe had tried the same trick, as had at least one P-47 Thunderbolt unit. But Reinberg perfected it. He was the man who solved the churning problem. A Marine pilot with a welding torch and empty ammunition cans had invented airborne ice cream manufacturing at 33,000 feet. There was also a quieter system operating across the entire Pacific Fleet, one that tells you everything about how the Navy valued ice cream as a form of currency. When a destroyer or submarine rescued a pilot who had been shot down at sea, the aircraft carrier that pilot belonged to was expected to pay a bounty to the ship that pulled him from the water. The standard payment, according to multiple veteran accounts, was 25 to 30 gallons of ice cream for the destroyer's crew and 2 bottles of whiskey for its captain and executive officer. Pilots were being ransomed in ice cream, and nobody in the United States Navy thought that was strange. If your family has a connection to the Pacific Theater, to any branch, any island, any ship, I would be honored to hear about it in the comments. What unit did they serve in? What do you remember them telling you about the war? Those small personal details, the things that never make it into the official histories, matter more than you might think. They are the actual record of what happened, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. Now, here is where the story turns. Because everything I have just described, the concrete barges, the Corsair ice cream flights, the Gedunk bars, the Forrestal memo, the pilot rescue bounties, all of that happened in a war in which the United States was fighting two enemies who were experiencing the exact opposite relationship with food. And to understand why the ice cream mattered, why it was not a luxury but a weapon, you have to understand what was happening on the other side of the battle line. On the German side, the contrast was brutal and progressive. Wehrmacht peacetime rations averaged 3,600 calories per day, and the combat field ration was a generous 4,500. German soldiers in the early campaigns ate reasonably well. Their iron ration, 2 of which every soldier carried, included 250 grams of hard Zwieback biscuit, 200 grams of preserved meat, 150 grams of concentrated soup, and 20 grams of ground coffee. It was basic. It was functional. It was nothing compared to what the average American GI was eating, but in 1939 and 1940, it was enough. By the middle of the war, Germany's food supply was collapsing under the weight of a conflict the nation could not sustain. German civilian ration card averages tell the story in numbers that drop like a thermometer in winter. In the winter of 1942-43, the average German civilian consumed 2,078 calories per day. By 1943-44, it had fallen to 1980. By 1944-45, 1670. By the winter, after surrender, 1945-46, it was 1412. The historian Nicholas Balabkins, writing about the Allied occupation period, described post-war German civilian rations as a fairly rapid starvation level. German soldiers drank ersatz coffee brewed from chicory, acorns, beech nuts, barley, chickpeas, and oats. It contained no caffeine. Their morale foods consisted of rock candy they called Candyzucker, lemon drops called Zitronentropfen, and a caffeinated chocolate called Coca-Cola in a distinctive red tin. Luftwaffe pilots used Vival mint candies to mask the smell of alcohol. In the occupied territories, the situation was far worse. French civilians averaged 1080 calories per day by late 1943. Polish civilians averaged 855, a figure so low that it constitutes slow starvation. Dutch civilians in the hunger winter of 1944-45, after the German blockade of the Western Netherlands, dropped to fewer than 370 calories per day. An estimated 22,000 people died. In German cities, families were keeping what they quietly called Dachhase, which translates to roof rabbit. It was a euphemism. They were cats, raised for food. This was the domestic reality of a nation that had started the war with the most powerful army in Europe. And then there was the Pacific. And in the Pacific, the contrast between American abundance and Japanese deprivation was not measured in declining ration cards. It was measured in bodies. In August of 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It was the first major American ground offensive of the entire war. The Marines seized the partially completed Japanese airstrip, renamed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, the Marine squadron commander killed leading a dive bomber attack at Midway, and dug in. What followed was 6 months of some of the most savage fighting of the Pacific campaign. Over the course of the battle, roughly 36,000 Japanese troops were committed to the island. Approximately 22,000 of them died there. The majority did not die from American bullets or Marine bayonets. They died of starvation and tropical disease, consumed by malaria and dysentery in foxholes where no food was ever going to arrive. The Japanese supply line to Guadalcanal was under constant interdiction by American aircraft from Henderson Field and by naval forces that contested the waters around the island in a series of brutal nighttime engagements. The naval battles of Guadalcanal in November of 1942, in which Admiral William Halsey's forces fought Japanese reinforcement convoys in close-range surface actions, were among the most ferocious naval engagements since Jutland. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, a cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 11 transport ships in those November battles alone. The supply convoys that did get through carried troops, not food. The men already on the island were left to forage. By December of 1942, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the Japanese 17th Army on Guadalcanal, sent a cable to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo that remains one of the most desperate military communications in modern history. He reported that no food was available and that his forces could no longer even send out scouts. He stated that his army could do nothing to withstand the enemy's offensive, and that the 17th Army now requested permission to break into the enemy's positions and die an honorable death rather than die of hunger in their own dugouts. The Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal had their own name for the island. They called it Starvation Island. A Japanese officer's diary, recovered after the battle, recorded the triage of starvation with clinical precision. Those who can stand, 30 days left to live. Those who cannot sit up, 1 week. Those who urinate lying down, 3 days. Those who do not speak, 2 days. Those who do not blink, tomorrow. In early February of 1943, Rear Admiral Shintaro Hashimoto's destroyers executed Operation KE, the nighttime evacuation of Guadalcanal. They pulled approximately 10,652 surviving soldiers off the island in 3 desperate night runs from Cape Esperance. Those men were the remnants of an army that had been told by an ideology rooted in the warrior code of Bushido that spiritual power would overcome material disadvantage, that suffering built strength, that endurance was its own weapon. They had endured beyond anything that could reasonably be asked of human beings, and they had lost. Meanwhile, 60,000 American troops on the same island had lost roughly 7,000 men, the majority in direct combat, and had been receiving regular supply shipments that included, among other things, ice cream. And somewhere on the Kokoda Trail in Papua New Guinea, in that same year, a Japanese soldier whose name has not survived in the English-language historical record looted an Australian supply dump and wrote an entry in his private diary that may be the single most revealing sentence any Axis soldier committed to paper during the entire war. His diary was translated and published in Craig Colley and Hajime Marutani's book, The Path of Infinite Sorrow. He wrote that the captured supplies were a feast beyond imagination, that it seemed as though they had suddenly landed in a fairyland. He noted that his own unit had run out of even their meager rice ration long before, and had been surviving on tasteless army crackers and the occasional wild potato. And then he wrote the line that anyone studying this war should stop and sit with for a moment. He wrote that here in the Papuan Mountains, the standard of living was higher than in Japan, and that he thought he saw something of the appalling power of Anglo-Saxon civilization that Japan had so recklessly challenged. He was not performing for an audience. He was not writing propaganda. He was a hungry man who had stumbled onto tinned meat and biscuits and who had experienced, in that single act of eating, a revelation about the nature of the war his country was fighting. Every like on this video is a small gesture, but it keeps stories like this one visible to the viewers who care about getting the history right. Not the version that flatters and not the version that simplifies, but the version that actually happened, with the names, the dates, and the uncomfortable truths intact. Now, what did German soldiers think when they encountered American abundance with their own eyes? Because many of them did encounter it, not usually on the battlefield, but in captivity. And what they said when they encountered it is one of the most quietly devastating chapters of the entire war. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States held approximately 400,000 German prisoners of war in camps spread across the country, from Alabama to Arizona to Colorado to Mississippi. Under the Geneva Convention, these prisoners were required to be fed at roughly the same caloric level as American troops. That meant approximately 3,400 calories per day. For men who had been living on declining rations, acorn ersatz coffee, and rock candy, the effect was immediate and overwhelming. Historian Arnold Kramer, whose book Nazi Prisoners of War in America remains the standard academic work on the subject, documented that German prisoners gained an average of approximately 25 pounds during their time in American captivity. But the weight gain was the least interesting part of the story. The interesting part was what the prisoners wrote in their letters home and what they said when they thought no one important was listening. A German prisoner named Karl-Heinz Oehlmann, held at Camp Opelika in Alabama in 1943, wrote a letter to his family that was intercepted and preserved by American military intelligence. He told them that the prisoners received cake almost every day, along with all kinds of fruit, Kellogg's flakes with milk, roasts, salads, real coffee, and crackers. He wrote that he often thought about how his family back in Germany would rejoice at such food and how urgently the children needed it. He noted that on the very day he was writing, they had been served 3 large fat pancakes and an omelette, just as a side dish, not as the main meal, as an afterthought. Another prisoner, Josef Krumbachner, held at Camp Como in Mississippi, gave an oral account that Kramer recorded. Krumbachner said that it was hard to believe, but while people were starving back in Germany, the prisoners in Mississippi were using flour to line their soccer fields. They had so much flour that the most creative use anyone could think of for the surplus was to mark the boundary lines of recreational sports pitches. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, documented by historian Ruth Beaumont Cook, the prisoners received so much ham and corn that they could not finish their meals. Surplus corn was buried in the ground outside their barracks. It later germinated and began growing. The camp guards had to explain to bewildered prisoners that the green shoots coming up outside their huts were not a victory garden, they were garbage. At Camp Papago Park in Arizona, at least one German prisoner who had successfully escaped into the surrounding desert turned himself back in upon learning that the camp's Christmas dinner menu was about to be served. He had weighed the value of freedom against the value of the holiday meal and decided the meal was the better deal. The American press was outraged. Newspaper editorials across the country demanded to know why enemy soldiers were eating better than some American civilians. The practice was never fully curtailed because the Geneva Convention required it, and because American military intelligence understood something the editorials did not. Well-fed prisoners cooperated more readily in interrogations. They revealed unit positions, command structures, and morale conditions. And they wrote letters home that passed through German military censors and told their families that the Americans had more food than they could possibly consume. Those letters, read by censors and passed along to neighbors and friends, were their own quiet form of psychological warfare. On Guadalcanal, there was a direct and documented connection between ice cream and combat operations. An army captain named John Burden, working alongside Marine intelligence officers, proposed a specific incentive to address the problem that American troops were bringing in almost no Japanese prisoners alive. His recommendation was simple. Any soldier who brought in a living Japanese prisoner of war would receive a 3-day pass and ice cream. It was one of the most direct documented uses of ice cream as an explicit combat incentive in the entire Second World War, and according to the available records, it produced results. On Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945, the contrast between American supply and Japanese deprivation reached its most extreme and violent expression. The island was 8 square miles of volcanic rock, defended by roughly 21,000 Japanese troops under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who had transformed the entire island into a network of tunnels, bunkers, and fortified caves. Nearly the entire garrison would be killed. On the American side, the Marines suffered nearly 6,000 dead and more than 17,000 wounded. It was one of the bloodiest engagements in Marine Corps history. On that island, a Marine from the 5th Marine Division reportedly cut a piece of his D-ration chocolate with a car-bar fighting knife, lit a chunk of Composition C, 2 demolition explosive as an improvised field stove, and brewed hot chocolate in his foxhole, while Japanese mortar rounds fell in the distance. The smell drifted into a nearby cave where a Japanese soldier had been hiding, starving, for days. According to the account passed down among veterans of the division, the soldier called out from the darkness, in broken English, and asked if he could have a cup. During the same battle, the interrogation of a captured Japanese senior non-commissioned officer named Sakai, who had served in Kuribayashi's headquarters, produced one of the most explicit statements from the Japanese side about the material contrast. According to the interrogation report, Sakai described how his unit's communications equipment had been destroyed willingly because the men felt they had been thrust into a losing war and had received inadequate food, clothing, and quarters. It was a rare moment of open bitterness from a Japanese soldier about the conditions his own military had imposed on him. Erwin Rommel, the German field marshal who fought the Americans in North Africa before being recalled to command the defences of the Atlantic Wall, left behind a collection of private papers that were edited and published after the war by the British military historian Basil Liddell Hart. In those papers, Rommel wrote that in Tunisia the Americans had paid a stiff price for their experience, but that the price had brought rich dividends. He noted that even at that early stage, American generals had demonstrated themselves to be advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. Liddell Hart, in his introduction to the volume, framed Rommel's later writings as reflecting the deep impression made on him by the material superiority of the Allies. Rommel had fought the British in the desert for 2 years and had beaten them repeatedly with inferior numbers. But after encountering the Americans, even briefly at Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, he understood that material superiority on the American scale was not merely a tactical advantage. It was a different category of warfare. Friedrich von Mellenthin, a German staff officer who served across multiple theatres, described the Allies in his memoir Panzer Battles as possessing seemingly inexhaustible resources. Hans von Luck, a panzer commander who fought from the invasion of Poland to the beaches of Normandy, recorded that his orderly, a soldier named Erich Beck, once said that the Germans admired their American opponents for their national pride and commitment, and that the Americans demanded their respect. These German officers had never seen the ice cream barges. They had never watched a Corsair return from 33,000 feet with ammunition cans full of chocolate ice cream, but they had felt the weight of the nation that could afford to produce all of it, the ice cream, the Coca-Cola, the chocolate, and simultaneously produce enough tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and warships to overwhelm the combined military output of Germany and Japan. In England, at a converted manor house called Trent Park in North London, British intelligence was holding captured senior German generals in comfortable conditions, giving them chess sets, books, and the run of the gardens, while recording every word they said to each other through hidden microphones. The transcripts from Trent Park and similar facilities in Britain and the United States, which combined run to roughly 150,000 pages, were later analysed by historian Soinke Neitzel in works including Tapping Hitler's Generals and the book Soldaten. They talked about the Eastern Front, about Hitler's interference, about war crimes they had witnessed or committed. And they talked, repeatedly, and with a kind of frustrated awe, about Allied material superiority. They used phrases like inexhaustible and overwhelming. They could not understand how a democracy that seemed disorganized and undisciplined could produce military output on a scale that dwarfed everything the German war economy could manage. The listening operation was run by Thomas Kendrick of MI-19, using German Jewish refugees as transcribers. The generals never knew. A parallel American program at Fort Hunt, Virginia, designated only as P.O. Box 1142, processed more than 3,000 prisoners and generated thousands of additional intelligence reports. Together, the British and American bugging operations represent the most honest and unguarded assessment of Allied power that any group of enemy officers ever produced. Because the ice cream was not an isolated program. It was part of a morale logistics machine unlike anything the world had ever seen, a machine that extended from ice cream barges to portable soda fountains to chocolate factories to cigarette rations, and which operated on a single underlying principle that no other nation in the war had either the resources or the philosophy to adopt. The principle was this: the man doing the fighting is not a tool. He is a citizen, and a citizen, even 10,000 miles from home in the worst conditions on Earth, has a right to be reminded that his country has not forgotten he is human. In 1941, Coca-Cola President Robert Woodruff issued a directive that would reshape the global beverage industry for the rest of the century. He declared that every man in uniform would receive a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he was in the world, and whatever it cost the company to get it there. In June of 1943, General Dwight Eisenhower sent a cablegram from Allied headquarters in North Africa that has become legendary in corporate history. He requested equipment for 10 portable Coca-Cola bottling plants, 3 million filled bottles of Coca-Cola, and enough supplies and equipment to produce 6 million additional bottles per month. Not water purification equipment, not ammunition, Coca-Cola. The company responded by building 64 bottling plants around the world entirely at its own expense. It dispatched 148 civilian employees to the war zones, men dressed in army fatigues and given equivalent officer rank, who became known across every theater of operations as the Coca-Cola colonels. They traveled with the troops, setting up bottling operations, sometimes within miles of the front lines. In the South Pacific, the company deployed 1,100 camouflaged portable soda fountains called jungle fountains, painted green to blend with the vegetation. More than 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola were consumed by American service personnel during the war. Coca-Cola was specifically exempted from military sugar rationing to keep production running at full capacity. The Hershey Company operated on a parallel track. Between 1940 and 1945, Hershey produced approximately 3 billion chocolate ration bars for the military. The original design, called the Ration D bar or the Logan bar, weighed 4 ounces, delivered 600 calories, was fortified with vitamin B1, and was engineered to survive temperatures up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit without melting. It was deliberately made to taste unpleasant, just bad enough that troops would carry it as an emergency ration rather than eating it for pleasure. The soldiers hated it. They called it Hitler's secret weapon because of its effect on the digestive system. By the end of the war, Hershey's factory was producing 24 million bars per week across 3 full floors of the plant. In 1943, Hershey introduced an improved version called the Tropical Bar, with better flavor, which remained in military service through Korea, through Vietnam, through Operation Desert Storm, and was even carried aboard the Apollo 15 lunar mission in July of 1971. And then there was Bert Baskin. In 1942, a Navy lieutenant commander named Burton Baskin was posted to Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, what is now Vanuatu, serving with Patrol Wing 1. Baskin was running the Navy exchange on the island, and he managed to trade with an aircraft carrier supply officer for an ice cream freezer. He started experimenting with local tropical fruits, making batches for the sailors and Marines on the base. He had no formal training in food science. He was a Navy officer with a freezer and a conviction that the men around him deserved something better than canned rations. Baskin came home from the war in 1946 and opened a small shop called Burton's Ice Cream in Pasadena, California. His brother-in-law, Irvine Robbins, had opened a shop called Snowbird Ice Cream in Glendale, California, the year before. In 1953, the two men merged their businesses. They flipped a coin to decide whose name would come first. Baskin won. The company became Baskin Robbins. The 31 flavors concept, one for every day of the month, descended directly from the experiments Baskin had conducted with that traded freezer on a Pacific island during the war. He died on Christmas Eve, 1967, at 54 years old. The chain he co-founded now operates nearly 8,000 stores in over 50 countries. Every single one traces its origin to a Navy exchange on Espiritu Santo. The economic numbers behind the ice cream story are as staggering as the ice cream itself. In 1940, the United States had a population of approximately 133 million, compared to Germany's 70 million and Japan's 73 million. But population alone does not capture the disparity. The American gross domestic product in 1944 was roughly 2.5 times Germany's and more than 4 times Japan's. By 1946, the gap had widened further, with American per capita income more than 6 times that of Japan and more than 4 times that of Germany. The United States ended the war with the largest economy relative to the rest of the world that any single nation has ever possessed. It was this economic foundation, this incomprehensible productive surplus, that allowed the military to operate ice cream barges, deploy Coca-Cola bottling plants, and ship billions of chocolate bars, while simultaneously outproducing every other nation on Earth in steel, aluminum, rubber, petroleum, aircraft, ships, tanks, trucks, and ammunition. There is a line from the United States Naval Institute's Naval History magazine that captures the science behind what Forrestal understood instinctively in 1944. Studies have demonstrated that ice cream is a comfort food that ranks above all others. It is the only food known to lower the human startle response. It is thought to invoke nostalgia that reminds individuals, especially those on long and demanding deployments, of childhood innocence, of security, and of family vacations. The wartime USDA Basic 7 food chart classified dairy as one of the essential food groups, and the dairy industry, led by the International Association of Ice Cream Manufacturers and the National Dairy Council, successfully lobbied to protect ice cream's status under that umbrella. The result was that ice cream was treated as a nutritional necessity rather than a luxury throughout the war. It was rooted in the emerging understanding that caloric intake alone does not determine how a man performs in combat. Psychological nourishment, the feeling that you are valued, that your life matters beyond your utility as a rifleman, affects behavior under fire in ways that no ration calculation can capture. A wounded man recovering in an army hospital who received a single spoonful of ice cream, according to the Quartermaster Corps reports, sometimes cried, not from pain. From the recognition that someone cared enough to bring him something that tasted like home, those hospital visits generated letters. The letters reached families. The families wrote to Congress. Congress pressured the War Department. The War Department expanded the ice cream program. The program that had begun with gedunk bars on cruisers ended with concrete barges producing 5 tons of ice cream per day in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Forrestal did not have the neuroscience. He had the observation. A man who has just eaten ice cream carries himself differently than a man who has not eaten in 3 days. Not because the calories make him physically stronger, because the ice cream tells him that someone behind the lines is thinking about him, that the country he is fighting for has not forgotten he is a person. The Japanese military philosophy was built on exactly the opposite premise. The Imperial Army's wartime interpretation of Bushido taught that luxury was the greatest menace to manhood, and that severe simplicity was required of the warrior class. The Japanese field ration in the South Pacific was as little as 600 grams of uncooked rice per day, about 2,160 calories, supplemented when possible by a compressed emergency ration of dried cooked rice, miso, powdered soy sauce, and salt. There were no chocolate bars. There were no soda fountains. There was no system of comfort supply. The ideology taught that a soldier who needed comfort was a soldier who lacked the spiritual will to fight, and that Japan's warrior spirit would compensate for whatever material advantages the Americans possessed. This was not, contrary to popular assumption, an ancient samurai tradition faithfully handed down through the centuries. It was a modern military construction, built largely on Inazo Nitobe's English-language book Bushido, The Soul of Japan, published in 1899. That book was itself a romantic idealization of samurai values, written for a Western audience, and the wartime Imperial General Staff had taken its most extreme elements and weaponized them into official military doctrine in the 1930s. The doctrine was tested on Guadalcanal, where Japanese soldiers died of starvation in their dugouts while reciting pledges of loyalty to the emperor. It was tested on Attu in Alaska in May of 1943, where more than 2,300 Japanese soldiers died, and the entire garrison was annihilated. It was tested at Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, where the Imperial Navy was permitted, in the language of the official operational order, to bloom as flowers of death. At every test, the philosophy proved that courage without calories is not a strategy. It is a death sentence delivered in the language of honor. There was one Marine who disagreed with the entire ice cream program, and his dissent is worth recording because of who he was. His name was Louis Burwell Puller, known throughout the Corps as Chesty Puller, the most decorated Marine in the history of the United States Marine Corps. He held 5 Navy Crosses. He had fought in Haiti, in Nicaragua, on Guadalcanal, at Cape Gloucester, and on Peleliu. Puller reportedly called ice cream sissy food and lobbied the newly formed Department of Defense for beer and whiskey rations instead, arguing that hard men deserved hard drink. The Department of Defense overruled him and chose ice cream. The most fearsome Marine who ever lived lost a bureaucratic argument about frozen dessert to an institution that understood something even Chesty Puller, for all his legendary toughness, did not fully grasp. That morale is a weapon, and that ice cream, on a given afternoon in a foxhole 10,000 miles from home was a more effective morale weapon than whiskey. So here is the verdict. When German soldiers learned that the American military was issuing ice cream to Marines in the Pacific, when prisoners in Alabama and Mississippi and Arizona saw what American abundance actually looked like from the inside, the shock was never about dessert. The shock was about scale. It was about facing a nation that could produce frozen treats and aircraft carriers simultaneously, in limitless quantities, without any visible strain on its economy or its people or its willingness to keep fighting. In 1946, the year after the war ended, American per capita ice cream consumption reached an all-time high of 23 pounds per person, more than 20 quarts. As the nation celebrated victory and sugar rationing was lifted, the men who came home had fought a war in which their enemies drank acorn coffee and ate wild potatoes and starved in tropical jungles. And they came home to a country where the frozen dessert aisle stretched 10 feet long. In March of 2018, a research vessel funded by Paul Allen discovered the wreck of the USS Lexington, 3,000 meters below the surface of the Coral Sea. The ship was largely intact. Her aircraft were still scattered on the ocean floor around her, their markings visible after 76 years. The year before the discovery, in July of 2017, the ashes of Julius Frey, the young aviation metalsmith who had smashed open the Gedunk hatch with a fire axe on the 1st of 8th, 1942, were buried at sea directly above the Lexington's resting place. The ceremony was conducted from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan, with full military honors. Frey lived into his 90s. He had told the story of the ice cream on the Lexington for more than 7 decades. He never told it as a joke. He told it the way a man tells you about something that mattered to him at a moment when nothing else did. He was 23 years old on a ship that was about to die, and someone had thought to put ice cream on that ship. And in the last hour before he went into the water, that ice cream was the thing that reminded him he was still a human being in a world that was trying very hard to reduce him to something less. The Japanese soldier on the Kokoda Trail called it the appalling power of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The German prisoner in Alabama wrote home about pancakes, served as a side dish. Forrestal's office called ice cream the most neglected of all important morale factors. They were all describing the same thing from different angles, not the dessert itself, what the dessert proved. It proved that the nation behind those men had so much wealth, so much productive capacity, so much organizational will, that it could wage the most destructive war in human history across 2 oceans and 6 continents, and still have enough left over to make sure a sailor on a sinking carrier could eat pineapple ice cream from his helmet before he went over. The side. That was the weapon the Axis powers could never match. Not the sugar, not the cream, not the freezer bolted to a concrete barge. The weapon was a civilization wealthy enough and organized enough to care about the comfort of a single man in the middle of a catastrophe. The men who fought against that civilization reached for words like soft and decadent, and none of those words were right. Because the nation that made ice cream for its Marines also made the tanks that crushed the Wehrmacht, and the bombers that burned the factories, and the ships that strangled the supply lines. It did all of it at once, and it never ran out of any of it. If this investigation gave you something to think about, that subscribe button is how you tell me to keep going. There are many more stories like this one, stories about the ordinary things that the men who fought this war remembered more clearly than any battle. Ice cream, hot chocolate, brewed with demolition charges. Coca-Cola served from camouflaged jungle fountains. The things that history books skip because they do not seem important enough. But they were important. They were important because they told a 19-year-old Marine on an island he had never heard of that somebody back home still knew his name. And that mattered more than any of them ever learned how to say.